Hi, Susan. It's nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you. If I had known of your work before I wrote my last book, I would have quoted some of it. So,
That's kind of you to say. I've been reading your new book, Left is Not Woke. And I think it's really kind of timed perfectly for right now. I think one of the things that I find very interesting is we've entered such a meta moment with this topic where the underlying political questions seem to get discussed less than the sort of conversational discursive issues about what are we talking about, who is allowed to talk about what, what is productive and what isn't. um, I have written, as you know, in the past about my frustration with the fact that it seems to me that there clearly has been, in the last 10-ish years, 10 or 12 years, a major evolution in what we might call social liberalism sort of is, what it focuses on, its tactics, its discourse, etc. But there's a real resistance to naming that. So, whoops. So one of the issues is that, you know, we once called this sort of thing political correctness, and that term was rejected. We called it identity politics, and that term was rejected. We've called it woke, and that has been rejected. There's also resistance to terms like critical race theory. If you use that term, it's very often immediately told that's not what this is or that isn't there. Why do you think this resistance to naming and this fixation on the nomenclature is so common in this debate?
well, first of all, there's enormous focus on naming in any case at the moment, which I think is born of despair. I really do think that many of the people who are pursuing what let's call woke activism are resigned to the idea that there's not much else you can change, but at least we can change our language. Very different from the way people were feeling. I mean, think about, so 12 years ago was Occupy Wall Street. To name some other things. And it was also absolutely possible that Barack Obama would have been followed by Bernie Sanders, okay? In which case we could have said, the arc of the universe is actually bending towards justice and progress before our eyes. We went from a Black liberal intellectual to an old white Jewish social democrat. I mean, it could have gone that way. And my guess is that the worldwide shock that Obama was followed by Trump created a sense of hopelessness across the world. It's funny, I was just talking with an old friend of mine who was a minister in the last Labor government in Israel. She said on the night of Obama's election, she was in a pub in Dublin with 100 Chinese tourists. So it's hard to get too much more multinational than that. And there was just really quite this worldwide sense of hope. At the moment, there's a worldwide sense of doom. And I think that's a big part of the woke movement. It's interesting. It's my generation, not yours, used the term political correctness as a self-ironic comment within the left. It then got co-opted by the right. And almost nobody remembers that this was actually a self-critical, we're being too dogmatic, let's not get Stalinist, don't be too politically correct. And that immediately got co-opted by the right. And so it's interesting that all of these terms have done so. I had not many, but a couple of friends of mine said, Susan, I basically agree with your arguments, but for God's sakes, don't use the word left in the title of your book, because you'll be giving aid and comfort to the right. And I really did think about it for a while, and decided there's just nothing else that names the phenomenon that we're talking about. My Dutch and German publishers got it right, actually. They had I love this I love this cover because it shows that the problem goes both ways. I think woke is not left and left is not woke. But I was extremely troubled by the fact that I was having conversations with friends in different countries who were listening to phrases like you use the word social liberal. I think it's usually thought of as being left. So we hear about the woke left or the far left or the radical left. And friends of mine who've been, working for justice their entire lives, and I guess I'm not on the left anymore. And that felt to me wrong. It felt like the term left had been taken over by people who were running on assumptions that were fundamentally anathema to the left. So that's why I wrote this. I should say, by the way, in case you think that woke is just a phenomena that affects American life, sad to say, it's extremely international.
You mentioned Obama, and the more that more time passes, I really think of him as being him and his administration as being this pivotal moment in the history of American political life. He ran on a message of hope and change. He was seen by many as someone who, if not a left figure, he was going to be a transformational liberal figure. At his victory party in the park in Chicago, I was there, and
I was there too. We could have met.
Oh yeah, all these people were making out in the park, and and it was this feeling that after all the darkness of the Bush years, that things had changed, and he governed as the sort of sensible technocrat who was interested in compromise and wanted to cut deals. Unfortunately, the Republicans in Congress on the other side of those deals had no interest in dealing with him at all, which is a thing that he seemed to just never understand. I mean, his administration seemed to be addicted to the idea that if he was just reasonable enough, they would make deals with him, not seeming to understand that they had absolutely every political reason to just be obstructionist. And so you mentioned Occupy also, and Occupy, I think, came from sort of a frustration of that sort of sense of the economy is in tatters, the labor market has been broken, and this guy is here talking about who came in on a wave of hope and change and is now just sort of talking like he's your dad, right? Like Obama was America's dad for 8 years. And he didn't really have a lot of solutions. And then, of course, Bernie Sanders ultimately failed. What I find particularly interesting is that, Obama has on several occasions publicly sort of harumphed about wokeness or social justice politics, et cetera. He doesn't make a lot of public statements. I mean, he has very carefully curated tweets that I'm sure he doesn't actually write himself. And but on some of his few, public expressions, he sort of said, this isn't the way we want to go. And it sort of makes me think about, there's this old saw that the first woman president will be a Republican, right? Because that will sort of create space. And this is sort of same thing with Obama, where the first Black president ultimately was not a sort of bomb throwing culture warrior. He was a sort of center left technocrat. I wonder if you think whether or not at present, you can look at Biden's victory in the 2020 primary as the triumph of sort of a center left sort of tendency to say, I'm the not very woke candidate, even though his administration makes many waves in that direction. Do you think that, and this is kind of abstract, do you think that Democratic politics sort of drives the sort of woke conversation? Does the woke conversation drive the sort of Democratic conversation? Are they just sort of separate entities that sort of evolve independently of each other?
No, and I think they're absolutely driving each other. It's a kind of like that. I think my least favorite moment in the 2016 conversation, the 2016 campaign, when Hillary Clinton was asked in some softball interview, what item did she always keep in her handbag? She said hot sauce. Now, this was about a year after Beyonce's great album Lemonade.
Mhm.
And it just seemed embarrassing. And then she had to go and say, well, actually, I really like hot sauce. Okay.
Yeah.
But, in the same way that I wish Joe Biden had just appointed Ketanji Brown and not said as a point of, campaign promise, I'm going to appoint a Black woman, okay, which immediately undercuts Ketanji Brown's, obvious qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice. So I think that, unfortunately, the centrist Democrats have realized exactly what some of my, and I take it your problem with woke is. And anyway, you can co-opt the diversity claims, and it's much easier to diversify any corporation in the world than it is actually to make systemic change. And so that's a problem. Just going back to Obama, though, I don't want to spend too much time talking about him, but I think history will view Obama differently than we view him today. If he made one mistake worse than hiring Larry Summers and Timothy Geithner to fix the financial crisis, and that was, if you like, an original mistake, although I think I understand it, given that a big reason why he won the election after this bruising campaign, when people all over the world said America's never going to elect a Black man. I knew a Puerto Rican who said he wasn't going to celebrate until he was actually sworn in because he thought he'd be killed between election day and inauguration day. So you get this bruising campaign, you get the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and you call up people who think of themselves as the smartest people in the room to deal with it. That was a huge mistake. But the other mistake, and it's hard for me to see this as a mistake because it's one I maybe tend to make myself, he really believed in the power of reason. And I'm not thinking of technocratic reason either. I think being the product of a marriage between an African and a white woman from Kansas made him think that actually in his own body, in his own history, he really could unite all of these different traditions and these different points of view. And he and all the rest of us deeply underestimated the racism that, crawled out from under the rock, basically, very quickly after he was inaugurated and created the Tea Party. So I think he could have been a great transitional figure. He himself has said, and you're right, some of his very few statements, that he wished he had handled the economy a bit differently. And in his words, paid more attention to Main Street than to Wall Street. It could have happened differently, but for the backlash that I think really had at its roots a deep racism and a deep resentment of the fact that, gosh, here was this Black family, all of them, including the grandmother, living in the White House, smarter, better educated, better looking, cooler, and with perfect integrity, whatever you may think of some of the individual policies, simply being on the world stage for 8 years. And I think that drove certain people who then went on to vote for Donald Trump absolutely crazy.
Mm-hmm. I think if I want to be as sympathetic as I can be to Obama, and if I want to see his presidency in the most positive light that I can, what I would say to myself is I think that he and his team were aware that he was going to have those 2 years after the 2008 election. He was going to have those first 2 years where he had Congress and they could do one big thing. And the question was what's the one big thing? And what can we get past the moderates in our own party? And I think that it's in the historical record that there was a debate within his administration. Do we do healthcare or do we do immigration? And they ended up doing healthcare. And there's a lot of problems with the Obamacare bill, but
Yeah.
again, a lot of that owes to they had to get the moderates in their party on board, and they were constrained, and that after that they were always going to be constrained by having an oppositional Congress for most of the rest of his administration. I think that the criticism is, again, like, he always seemed to act as though there was a world in which he could do outreach to the Republicans and they'd say, "Oh, great, let's work together," when that was always a fantasy. It was always a fantasy.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But think about, to get back to the question of woke, which, as Nate Cohn recently pointed out, was not once used during the 2016 election. It's, and it will probably be the word most used in 2024. I've been thinking about people like my own children and even people who are younger. You and I were in Grant Park, and it was an incredible celebration. I just remember standing next to, old Black men saying that I should live to see this day. I mean, people, it really, it marked a huge, huge step forward. Okay. We all thought. For people who grew up where that was the norm. It was a norm to have this Black family in the White House. It was a norm to see them on the world stage. It wasn't a particular achievement. That's just what they were used to as children or teenagers or whatever, young adults. And then to see the crash, okay, in 2016, I think that enormous shock is what gave rise to this tendency or movement. It's not a formal movement. I don't see this, by the way, as a generational battle, because I know lots of gatekeepers in their 50s and 60s who have, run to get on board, if only out of fear of losing touch with young people, okay? Or what they think young people want to hear. But it certainly started in American universities. And here we are now.
I think that you can sort of see the limits of identity politics, both sort of in Obama's administration and in the Hillary Clinton campaign, because, a little factoid that's thrown out there a lot is, Obama was the first Black president, but during his administration was, since the civil rights movement, was like the worst 8 years, the worst 8-year stretch in that period in terms of the widening of the Black-white wealth gap. So while there was a Black man in as president, the Black-white wealth gap widened more than at any other point. Of course, a lot of that had to do with the financial crisis, which obviously wasn't his fault, but it does show sort of like the limits of, okay, yes, you have this symbolic victory, which isn't genuinely important, but you also have this sort of the on the ground reality that's not necessarily getting better. And then with Hillary Clinton, I mean, specifically, you have, her campaign's many sort of ham-fisted outreach in ways that were sort of intended to signal the right things in terms of identity politics. So she infamously said, if we broke up the big banks tomorrow, would racism still exist? Would sexism still exist? Yes, which of course isn't an answer to the question of whether breaking up the banks is a good idea. But the other thing was that at a certain point, right, in a sense, yes, Barack Obama was a symbol of Black America, but he was also a particular person who happened to be extremely charismatic and made many people trust him, such that you had the phenomenon of millions and millions of people who voted for Obama twice and then for Trump, right? Because they just trusted and were persuaded by Obama. And then you had Hillary Clinton, who, yes, was, her campaign was all about how she was this avatar of womanhood. But Hillary Clinton had always been an immensely divisive and unpopular figure in American politics. And I remember having this conversation during the campaign in 2016, where I would say, even going back to when she was just the first lady, Bill Clinton's first lady, she polled very poorly in terms of like net favorables and unfavorables. She poured among the worst of any public figure in American life. And they would always say, well, that's misogyny. That's what it's sexism is the reason why she's unpopular. To which I would say, probably that's involved, but it doesn't ultimately matter if she is unpopular, right? And one of the things that happened in 2016 was there was this refusal to understand that saying that she was unpopular because of sexism didn't change the fact that she wasn't unpopular. In other words, in a debate club atmosphere, you could sort of slap somebody down by saying, oh, she's only unpopular for the wrong reasons. But it doesn't change the fact that a politician has to be popular.
Sure. I agree with you. But that does take us back to Obama's extraordinarily popular personality, okay, which you wanted to discount a little bit. And, I can remember in 2008, first of all, friends of mine say, very savvy American friends of mine saying, Susan, only somebody who's lived too long in Europe would believe that a Black intellectual could become president of the United States. That was the first thing I heard. And the second thing I heard was, but you're a middle-aged white woman, shouldn't you be voting for Hillary? And no, I deeply prefer Barack Obama for all kinds of reasons, having nothing to do with his gender or his race. So, let's not forget that symbols are important. Persona is important, and those are things that ought to matter. They now, of course, when we go down that direction, the fact that some half of the United States finds Trump's persona appealing and authentic, and the other half of us find it appalling, then we have to say, okay, obviously these are not fully objective criteria. But the interesting thing is that Bernie Sanders, despite being an old white man who doesn't have much charisma, is not a great speaker, is sort of grumpy, persona. He had millions of 20 to 30-year-olds who would have done anything to see him as president of the United States. So, I'd love to get away from these identity categories. There's this whole discussion about whether America is becoming a gerontocracy if the only people who are running for president are too old. Bernie Sanders could have drawn people were the word socialist in the United States not so poisoned that, that made it impossible. I don't know if you remember, but the day before the South, or maybe a week before the South Carolina primary in 2020, some Republican newspaper dug up something good he had said about the health system in Cuba and called him on it. Here is Bernie Sanders supporting the socialist dictatorship. And Bernie doubled down and said, yeah, there are a lot of problems in Cuba, but they have a great health system. By the way, had he known more about Cuba, and I don't think he really knows enough about the rest of the world, actually, he could have said they also have a fantastic educational system, and it's so good that all of the South American diplomats vie to be posted to Cuba if they have young children, because they know it has the best educational system in Latin America. But that did him in, I believe. That was the moment at which, having won several primaries, he had no chance. But, one of the points that I make in my book, Left is Not Woke, aside from the fact that identifying people according to these categories used to be considered reactionary and essentialist, is that it's crazy to think that of all the identities we have, and all of us have many, that these two, the ones we have the least control over and the ones that express the least agency, have become the two that seem most important. And that's a big problem right now.
Yeah. And I think that this is especially true in the era of Trump, where there has been a how can I put this, an evaporation of the sort of basic ideological, substantive basis for politics that I never would have thought I would have seen before Trump. So what I mean specifically is, if you would ask me in say 2012, you said, what is the core of American movement conservatism? What animates the Republican Party? I would have said, well, conservative Christianity is the heart of the party. It is the organizing force of movement conservatism that sort of hangs over everything. It's immensely important to their get out the vote efforts, etc. The sort of networks of churches that do that sort of thing, and also entitlement reform. Cutting Social Security and Medicare one way or the other. Paul Ryan had made that a mission for 10 years, and he was the ideas man of the Republican Party and was the Speaker of the House and the vice presidential candidate for Mitt Romney. And these were the things that seemed to sort of underpin movement conservatism. And in 2016, they nominated a guy and elected a guy who just could not care less about Christianity and who promised not to touch Social Security and Medicare, and that was seen as a key part of why he was appealing to so many people. And so ever since then, I just feel like we're sort of in this space where, of course, we can name issues on which Republicans and Democrats disagree, and they're important issues, and bills get passed, and there's political fights. We just saw Roe v. Wade go down, which is a huge victory for movement conservatism. I mean, it's very concerning. But at the same time, there is this sense that that something has sort of come unmoored in American politics in the sort of the ideas of like basic underlying political values. If you look at the Democratic primary of 2020, in the primary, they're all sort of running to the left, right? Even Biden was running to the left in the 2020 primary because they were scared of the threat of Bernie Sanders. But it didn't seem like there was a sort of okay, this is what the Democratic Party is right now, right? Like the last Democratic president was Mr. Technocrat. He brought us a sort of weird amalgamation of sort of neoliberalism and state-sponsored medicine, and he sort of ran as as Mr. Cool Guy who you can always count on. Well, what does it mean to be a Democrat when Bernie Sanders has presented this alternative vision, which is a strong social democratic sort of proud lefty point of view? And at the moment, more than at any time in my adult lifetime, I don't know what the parties are. I don't fundamentally know what they stand for.
Yeah. So let me push back just on one more point. I'm not accepting the designation of Barack Obama as Mr. Technocrat. I think he was a lot more than that. Okay, and but let me say a couple of words. So I do follow American news probably as much as probably more than I follow any other news, but I do not live in the United States. And so I look at a fair number of different countries when I'm trying to educate myself about what's going on in the world. And, one thing I would say is the vagaries of American politics are so weird compared to other people's that I'd much rather talk, as I did in this book, about what is fundamentally left or liberal than about what is fundamentally democratic or Republican. I mean, one way in which America is absolutely out of sync certainly with Europe, is that Bernie Sanders would have been considered so conservative in Europe that he couldn't have gotten elected. I mean, he was to the right of Angela Merkel, who was a center-right politician, okay? In terms of, just because the things that Americans call entitlements are called rights in Europe. And, that's a huge difference in the way that you look at the world. But let's talk, I set out because of this whole discussion over the woke left or the far left or whatever. I really thought it might be time for me just to get clear about myself, for myself, but what were fundamental principles that were common to the liberal left, okay, people on the liberal left. And I came up with three. Someone might come up with more, and that's fine with me. The one is that it's essential for people on the liberal left to be universalists. That is, the right was always tribal, believing that the only people that you deeply connect with and therefore have real obligations to are members of your own clan. A former student of mine objected to the use of the word tribal because he was afraid it would be disrespectful to Native Americans. And I just have to say, the concept tribal comes from the Bible, okay? And it's a hard word because the first tribal experiences that are described in the Bible are, the different heads of the tribe of, Jacob's sons killing one brother because they were jealous of his coat. Okay, that's what tribes do. And that was always the right-wing view, that we cannot abstract to something like the human being, whereas the left said we damn well can, and we may come from different cultures with different histories, but the fundamental thing about us is that we're human beings. And the fundamental thing about every revolution, whether it be a feminist revolution, whether it be an anti-colonial revolution, is always, I too am a human being, okay? And with that is a normative claim to certain human rights. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about today's woke is the abandonment of that kind of universalism. And I sort of get it because, and this has not to do with 2016, but with something that goes back a few decades earlier. I don't think the left has recovered from the neoliberal revolution of 1991. I do not think that we've come to terms with the collapse of state socialism. We never had an international discussion of what went wrong. How did these socialist ideals turn into Stalinism, or if not Stalinism, some authoritarian, messy, restrictive situation. Instead, everybody kind of keeled over. I know people who spent, a decade arguing what kind of Marxist are you, or what kind of socialist are you, and suddenly they were all saying, I always knew it led straight to the gulag, and there's no alternative to global neoliberalism. Well, global neoliberalism appeals to the universality of the desire for commodities, but it doesn't bind us together through any principles. That's not solidarity, okay? And I think that part of so you have nationalism on the right, which is rejecting this kind of, we're all universal consumers who want the next version of the iPhone. And then on the left, it's, you are your ethnic identity. So point one, universalism over tribalism. Point two, there's a principled distinction between justice and power. You can't always make that distinction because, it often comes to the same thing. Disempowered people should have more power to determine their lives. Nobody's denying that, but you certainly get in some parts of the woke, and you get it in the theorists that have most influenced them, people like Foucault, the idea that you cannot really tell the difference between justice and power, and justice is just hype to cover up one group's power claims against another group. And this is, of course, when you had the liberal bourgeois revolutions of the 18th centuries, the idea that you had one law that, obligated both princes and peasants to do the same thing, that was unimaginable. You have all of these old songs about the peasant stealing the prince's deer and being hung for it. That was just the way the world was. And the prince steal the peasant's daughter, and that was also the way the world was, and that's been forgotten. And the third thing that both liberals and left-wing people traditionally have held on to is the idea of progress, that progress is simply, it's not something in heaven, that we're not subject to a long, slow decline. It's something that people working together can make on their own. Now, of course, a lot of woke activists want to make progress, no question about that. Mm-hmm. But there's not a real idea of what progress involves. So that if you view all of history, say, if you view the most important thing about history as that it was racist and sexist in the terms that we see those things today, it's hard to actually go ahead to make more progress if you think that none has been made in the past. And, you've got a lot of theories and a lot of theoretical assumptions suggesting that we don't make any, not just philosophical theorists, but people like evolutionary biologists who think that basically we're all just performing something that our unknowable hunter-gatherer ancestors did 200,000 years ago. And those are the kinds of ideologies that in fact affect people whatever side of the political spectrum they're on. So those are the three things that I think are common to liberals and leftists. The difference that I would make between liberals and leftists is that leftists also believe in social rights, which they don't consider to be benefits or entitlements. They think fair labor conditions and education and healthcare are not benefits, but rights. And they believe that to assert those rights is not a utopian undertaking, but a question of justice. So that's the difference. But given the dangers of the right, I'm happy to work with as big a tent as I can find.
The same. Yeah. So I'm thinking about that list that you made there and something that I thought about when reading your book. So the concept, the thing that I've written about, actually I read about it in my new book, which is coming out in September, is the concept of colorblindness in racial politics. So Barack Obama got elected. And there were some people who, not many of them, but a few who were in too much of a rush and who said, this demonstrates that America is a race-blind society. And that was incorrect, obviously. You could check reams of stats to demonstrate that there's still immense racial inequality in our country, and interpersonal racism is still far too common, et cetera. And so there was a understandable and necessary pushback against the notion that we had entered a race-blind period. But I think a good indication of where things have gone wrong is now there are many people, particularly in academia, who will tell you that the concept of race blindness as a goal is inherently racist or otherwise undesirable. So they'll tell you, like, the concept of a future where race is no longer seen as a salient dimension of human society, and where we don't pay attention to race and we treat everyone the same as a goal for the future, that is itself to be deprecated and is indicative of white supremacist perspective or whatever. And so for me, I totally understand being sensitive about declaring that now we have achieved something like a race-blind society when we certainly haven't. But I still maintain the goal of race blindness, where in the sense that everyone should be seen equally regardless of their race. And that was a very basic definition of what, for example, the civil rights movement was fighting for, was for racial equality, for equality under the law, and social equality, economic equality, et cetera. And I don't think that race blindness is a bad or wicked goal. I think that it's important to not get ahead of ourselves and recognize that we still have a long way to go. But the idea that race blindness in and of itself is something wicked that we shouldn't pursue is, to me, an abdication of the basic concept of anti-racism as it's existed for 60 plus years.
So I basically agree with you, but I've always been stuck a bit on the word blindness. And I think of an anecdote that happened to me as a Jewish woman who's lived in Germany for a long time, when someone mistook some part part of my, I'm like, I have black curly hair. I wave my hands a lot. I talk in certain ways. And he misattributed that to my being a Southerner because I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. I had to correct him and say, no, actually, I do come from the South, but I'm an atypical Southerner. What you're noticing is that I'm Jewish. I mean, most people think I was born on the Upper West Side and who know anything about American culture. And I totally embarrassed the man because he said, oh my God, that's not something I would notice. That plays no role for me at all. And, as if noticing that I had some traits that are common to Jews and other people from the Mediterranean originally, as if that was offensive. So, I get that the idea of absolute race, there's something weird about the idea of not noticing what color people are or what sort of ethnic background they come from. But of course, I agree with you entirely that the goal should not be to hammer us to one of our identities, rather than looking forward to meeting people in the whole variety of identities that we all are. And I guess I feel the same way about women who put their identity as women in the center of themselves. I mean, sometimes my identity as a woman is the most important thing to me, if I'm dealing with sexism, say, which still exists. But at other times, I have a whole bunch of different identities that are quite important to me. Left-wing thinker, philosopher and writer, mother of 3 children, American expat, all of those things are, depending on what situation I'm in, absolutely as deep as the fact that I'm a woman or the fact that, according to current conceptions, I'm coded as white. I wasn't as a child. The Jews in various parts of the world are only considered to be, kind of precariously white. So anyway, identities shift not only personally in people's own lives, but also socially, depending on which piece is being uplifted or emphasized at a particular time. And my goal would be for all of us just to recognize that rather banal truth and act accordingly.
You discuss progress as being an inherent element of left and liberal philosophy going back a long way. And I think one of the things that I personally think is like core to a woke worldview is an extreme pessimism about the possibility of progress, and often like a resistance to identifying progress. So to give you an example, recently, I wrote a piece for my website about this phenomenon where over the last 15-ish years, Black women have seen the greatest growth in all manner of educational metrics. So the speed with which Black women are improving in things like getting college degrees outstrips everybody else in terms of their rate of improvement. And there still are below white women who do the very best, or Asian women, but there's been a great deal of improvement among Black women. And one of the things that's happening is that it's creating a dating market problem because most people want to partner within their race. And Black women now are vastly more educated than Black men, to the point where almost 3/4 of every master's degrees that are earned by Black people are earned by Black women rather than Black men. And so this creates a dynamic in dating markets where they can't find partners who are equally educated or equally high earning as they are. And it's creating these sort of interesting sociological phenomenon. And it was generally well received, but I had a few people who were unhappy about it, and interacting with them. The reason wasn't because they didn't identify the specific phenomenon I was saying. The reason was because it depended on acknowledging that there's been tremendous growth among Black women economically and educationally in the last 15-ish years. And like that was seen as somehow to affront that, to discuss this improvement among Black women, the number of sociological factors was seen as to somehow minimize the continuing problems. And this, I encounter this just all the time among a
I
certain
do
set of
too.
people. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you simply say, hey, this is a good thing that's happened, then they say, well, you're not paying attention to the right things. And I don't know where that comes from, but it seems to me to be completely unsustainable to define yourself as a movement that's dedicated to the improvement of marginalized people, but is resistant to ever acknowledging improvement among marginalized people.
So I think I do know where it comes from, at least partly. I mean, most interesting phenomena have more than one cause.
Mm.
One of the places it comes from is from the work of Michel Foucault. And this is true even for people who have never read a word of him, although he's the most read quoted theorist in post-colonial theory. But I was trained in philosophy. I do talk about philosophers in this book because these are philosophers whose work gets into the mainstream. Some journalist read a copy of a book in college and took over a set of assumptions that we are all repeating, even if we've never read those books. Foucault famously argued that all the things, or most of the things that we think are instances of progress, are actually more subtle versions of repression. And although you might say that some of those insights are useful in helping to undermine repression, he gave absolutely no suggestions about how one might get out of that, leaving people thinking, and it will sound crazy if any of your listeners haven't actually read this, but he begins his most famous book by talking about somebody who was drawn and quartered for attempting an assassination of a French king. And when you finish reading that book, but then he talks about how prisons are more subtly but insidiously oppressive. And you almost feel at the end of the book that it would be better to go back to drawing and quartering. Now, he doesn't actually say that, of course, because most of these critiques of progress go together with an unwillingness to actually make straightforward claims like this is better and this is worse. And prison reformers who talked to Foucault at the time, tried to get him to talk about specific things that prisoners were demanding that would be improvements in their lives, longer visiting hours or more access to books or flush toilets in their cells. And this is trivial, okay? And I completely agree with your example, although I feel for the problems that it may cause educated Black women looking for partners, but to deny that, things have improved is really also, I mean, it's not only to deny facts, which is always a bad idea, but I think it's an insult to all of the people who worked and occasionally gave their lives to make the kind of progress that we now take for granted. I mean, progress is a funny concept, as I sort of was realizing. It starts from a state of wherever we are now, and wants the progress, sees the deficits in wherever we are now, and is indignant about the fact that we're not further, and that makes sense. But to make more progress, you have to believe that some has been made in the past.
So we're going to wrap up soon, so we should probably talk about the future. I will say, I think politics is inherently cyclical in a certain sense, and I don't think anything that dies ever dies for good. And I think that it's really hard to know where you are in a cycle when you're in it. I do think that there has been something of a thawing of what we might call the sort of woke stranglehold on academia and on media to some degree. My new book is about the 2020 George Floyd protest movement, and it is sympathetic but critical. And I have told people, I sold it in 2022, and I don't think I could have sold it a year before I did. Yeah. So like that sort of thing has happened. Where do you think this is all going? Are you optimistic? I know you talk about it in the book, but for the people watching, where do you think this is headed?
So whenever I get a question like that, I want to say, hey, I'm a philosopher. I never said I was a prophet. And I've been surprised by a lot of things in my life. So I'm hesitant to make, real predictions. I do see a pushback against woke. I mean, you're right. You couldn't have sold a book like that in 21. I know several people who were trying to write critical books in 20 or 21 and could not get traction, even people who are very well-known authors with very good agencies. So that's absolutely right. I think we're seeing something that happened to me when I was just in the States last month, talking about Left is Not Woke, my book. I finally, after I'd had a few of these book presentations, I started saying, this book began as a result of the conversations that I was having with friends in private, and I bet you all have been having too, and everybody would laugh and nod, because it's clear that certainly among members of, let's say, the liberal left intelligentsia, which encompasses everybody from people who run museums and theaters to people who run universities, there is a sense that something's gotten off. And the success of books like John McWhorter's Woke Racism and, a few other things, I think, does express the sense that I keep hearing in private conversations. Where is this going? So I do see that. I also see, however, how woke Europe was behind the US, but it's taken it up with a great deal of enthusiasm. So I see a slightly delayed reaction in all of the cultural institutions that I'm involved with in Berlin, but also people that I talk to in other countries. I'm not sure. Let me say two things about hope. One is it has to be distinguished from optimism. Optimism is a statement about the way the world is, and hope is an attitude with which you might change those facts, okay? And as both Immanuel Kant and Noam Chomsky have said, if we don't retain hope, we won't retain the will to make change. Ergo, hope is, it's not necessarily a feeling, it's a moral obligation. So that has always been, my conviction. I have to stay hopeful. Otherwise I'm abandoning the ship, basically. And I feel like, we were put here in some sense to help steer the ship and make sure it doesn't go under. Here's a piece of a fact that sometimes makes me hopeful, although it's a very precarious sense of hope. I think the world right now is faced with two huge dangers. One is the climate crisis, and the other is the rise of fascism. And we're told to be very careful with words, but somehow we keep running around the word fascism and calling it anti-democratic or authoritarian or whatever we want to call it. As a matter of fact, people who think you can overthrow an elected government by force are fascists. Narendra Modi is a fascist. There are people who call themselves fascists in Netanyahu's government. Putin doesn't have a better name, et cetera, et cetera. We dodged a bullet with Bolsonaro, so this is a worldwide problem that people are not naming properly. And it will, if the left, if liberals and leftists cannot come together, then that dual problem really will do us in, because the only way the climate crisis can be solved is if we put aside these nationalist, tribalist movements that are driving fascist governments or quasi-fascist governments. So, my sort of empirically grounded hope. Well, no, it's not really empirical, because we know that the climate crisis is real, at least outside of the United States. Most of the world recognizes it. We also know that the rise of fascistoid governments is real. And if I'm not making an Obama like mistake and putting too much faith in the power of reason, one would think the only reasonable way we're going to deal with those twin dangers is to set aside the nationalism and for the left and liberals to come together. It's a hope. It's not more than that. But if we give that up, we are lost.
I think you're right that Bolsonaro is, to me, an example that we should rally around, which is in a government that has traditionally had a lot of instability, thanks in large part to the American government. You had a genuine fascist in power who was popular with a decent chunk of his own populace, and he lost an election to a hard leftist, and by enough margins that he felt that he couldn't just use the state to crush his opponent. I think that's the best kind of hope that we can take. Susan, the book is Left is Not Woke. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Pleasure to meet you, Freddie. Hope to see you again.
Absolutely. Bye.